so much. How's everybody doing? Those of us who work in City Hall make promises all the time. Some of them we keep, some of them we don't. One promise I can make to you right now is there is not a single equation in this presentation I'm about to show you. So hopefully you guys enjoy kind of what we're doing here. It's nice talking to a group of folks from EERI because I think I'm talking to a group of folks that really understand how San Francisco's approached this. This certainly isn't something that started with my hiring 3 years ago. This is something that started really, it's in our DNA in San Francisco. And the efforts that we've made after Loma Prieta and since then have really set us up for success. And so we get to be the beneficiary of that success, but it's also a stark reminder that we have so much more to do on the public policy side of things. I'm going to walk you through, obviously, the topic today, talking about non-ductile concrete buildings is kind of the key here, but I did want to give a quick background and an update on some of the other efforts that we've been doing in our program, just because many of you have spent a lot of time and invested in some of these efforts, so I just wanted to be fair and give you an update on some of these things. But to start from the beginning, show of hands, who is involved in this room in the Community Action Plan for Seismic Safety in one form or another? I refuse to believe that Lawrence is the only person raising their hand. Okay, great. So I think this is a tremendous effort. It seems like a small thing sometimes, but when I travel and talk to other local jurisdictions, the fact that they got the community together to think about how we address earthquake risk and to develop a comprehensive plan that's community driven, you don't see that anywhere else in the world. Us working with the city of LA has been a great experience. When Dr. Lucy Jones was in Garcetti's office, we had this great dialogue going on, sharing legislation. And while we know San Francisco solutions are not LA solutions and vice versa, we can still work together. And so us sharing a lot of that hard work allowed them to do basically in 1 year what took us 10. And that's great to see them passing Softstory ordinances, non-ductile concrete retrofit ordinances. I mean, this is huge stuff. And now that we have San Francisco and LA marching basically to the beat of the same drum, Sacramento's paying attention. So if we want to talk about code changes at the state level, I think we're starting to get primed for that. So it's a really exciting time. There, of course, you can see a picture of my good friend and colleague, Lawrence Cornfield, who really deserves a tremendous amount of credit for really keeping this effort alive. This is a hard thing to do in government sometimes, and people move on to the next shiny thing. And to keep people focused on the real risk and hazards that we face takes a lot of work, and it's not easy. But from that great work in CAPS, eventually we ended up with ESIP, the Earthquake Safety Implementation Plan. Taking the works that ATC and the CAPS crew did, turning it into a 30-year plan. Over 50 tasks, real tasks, tangible tasks that we can do to reduce risk. What's interesting about that is my team and I recently got back from New York. The mayor's had me working on a lot of post-disaster housing scenarios and how we're going to keep our population here after a disaster. So obviously tremendous lessons learned from Superstorm Sandy. And talking with them there, they're having this conversation now about how do they adapt their building stock for extreme weather. And they start getting paralyzed because they don't know how to talk about high-rise buildings in the same sentence with single-family homes. And you start having these different types. And so then we started talking a lot about our Softstory ordinance. And they said, oh, well, it's one type of building, and you guys got that figured out. And first of all, I explained it wasn't that simple. Second of all, then I explained that this is just one particular hazard. You got to look at this whole list, because that's the paralysis that cities like New York are feeling, where they have this huge problem, and they haven't figured out how to compartmentalize these different issues and attack them, whether it's based on construction type or sensitive occupancies, but breaking down the world that way so you can really come up with a mitigation plan that's tailored to your specific geographic needs. The Softstory program, obviously, I don't think this is news to any of you in the room. It's been going on for several years now, but what I did want to give you an update on is some of you have seen me present this slide before. Some of these figures have not changed. There's still about 825,000 people in San Francisco. We still have about 150,000 privately owned buildings. But these last two figures have changed. We noticed about 6,700 properties in the Softstory ordinance, and from that, now we have a pool of over 5,000 that's going to retrofit by 2020. Those of you who participated in the sidewalk survey or the public policy scoping survey for Softstory know that number ended up being about 2,800 when we actually went back and did the real data, and then also expanded the scope to really be looking at 2 stories over a Softstory condition. That's how you get this number. So when we talk about terms of total impact, there's about 120,000 San Franciscans that live in this demographic of buildings. So you think about 15% of the total population of San Francisco currently living in a vulnerable building that will be retrofit by 2020. A pretty exciting program, but again, a very small bite at a very large apple, so we're far from done. Many of you are also familiar about how we had to talk to the public about this. When we were looking at buildings to get an idea of the policy work, we certainly didn't want to send people into alarm. Because when we were looking at the outside of buildings, we weren't making any kind of engineering analysis or any assumptions of what was behind those garage doors or behind those commercial storefronts. So we did this, we took this method, and actually this map is now on display in the Washington, D.C. National Building Museum. So it's really exciting that they're recognizing some of the policy work that's happening here in San Francisco. But what we did is kind of constructed a heat map. So those darker areas are actually showing a higher density of potential soft-story buildings. This was before we had done the screening, so now we have a much more definitive data set. But it was a way to take risk communication to a different level. I think sometimes when we go out there, we get very nervous about inciting panic, and we should. We should always be very careful about that. This was a way to show the electeds and to show the property owners in San Francisco that this was not a Marina District problem in 1989. Soft-story buildings are found in literally every single district in every neighborhood of San Francisco. So it was a really good way to kind of dispel some of the myths that have been created through the media over the years, and how people's memories tend to focus on what they saw on the news and not reality sometimes. Tremendous amount of outreach was continued with Softstory, and then continues today with our other programs. And the pictures you see up here are just some of the examples. The one up on the left-hand corner is Mayor Lee and I holding our financial summit. Before we actually even introduced the Softstory ordinance, we got about 20 private bank CEOs together. And what we told them is we said, we didn't want you to change what you already do. We didn't want to change your business model. We don't want you to change your underwriting criteria. We just want you to come to the table and help. And what that did is help foster a menu of financing options for folks. We created our own financing program, which I'll talk about again in a few slides here. But this was a way to know that if you look back, many of you were engineers working on some of the brick buildings here in San Francisco. The UMB loan fund was a $350 million general obligation bond. And we've only used about $50 million over 20 years. So that tells you that people didn't want to deal with the red tape of qualifying for a government program. So we took a different approach. When we created our program, we actually did it in a way that didn't go to the ballot. It didn't raise property taxes citywide. And we launched it in December, and we have about $45 million in underwriting right now. So it's really exciting to see that program off the ground. Some of the other photos here, just things that we did. Of course, lots of information sessions. EERI, SEONC, everybody in the engineering community was hugely helpful when we were doing that. We certainly couldn't have done it without you because, like I always say, I'm not an instructional engineer. I just play one on TV, so I always need someone to back me up with the real technical answers. Community outreach, of course, was huge. And the bottom right corner there, the Earthquake Retrofit Fair. This is the single largest outreach event we've ever had around seismic safety in San Francisco. Many of you participated there, many of you had tables there, many of you were sponsors of the event. We had over 3,000 people there and almost 200 vendors. I can't think of a time where we've been able to offer services like that to the community, where they could walk in, and if a person had never run a construction project before, they could go talk to 5 or 6 engineers. They could go talk to 6 different contractors and really get an idea of what's out there and what this is really going to cost them. So it was a huge successful effort, and we plan on doing another one, which I'll talk about a little bit here. This is a data snapshot of August, so it's a little out of date right now, but the data hasn't changed tremendously since then. You already heard me talk about the fact that we have over 5,000 buildings in. What you do see here, though, is you have a lot of early adopters. Over almost 700 permits, actually it's about 850 permits that are in process right now, and about 600 of them have actually gotten CFCs and been complete. So we're seeing soft-story buildings well ahead of their assigned tier doing this work because the owners have already accepted that this is a smart move. And I think that's due to a lot of the outreach that we did. And when I say we, I mean all of us. We were all out there talking to building owners about their risk and demonstrating them that for this small cost of retrofitting, you actually are protecting a multi-million-dollar investment, especially in this economy. The average permit retrofit cost as reported on the permits is about $70,000. I have to put an asterisk next to that because I think everybody notoriously lowballs the permit cost when they put that on the permit application, but that's the data as it shows today. I actually also do want to mention that placard too. So many of you saw this placard when it went up. Code enforcement is one of the hardest things that a jurisdiction has to do. And at the time the screening process was over, for those of you who remember, there was a 1-year screening process where every owner had to have a design professional complete this form, assign a compliance tier, and then submit it to the department. Well, we had about 300 folks out of the 6,700 that didn't do it, so already tremendously high numbers right at the very end. But then once we started putting these placards up, we went from about 300 non-compliant to 3 in the course of about 3 months. So show me another code enforcement mechanism this successful to be able to drive those kind of factors of compliance. It was a tremendously useful tool, and we put a lot of thought into the design of this. I mean, how many times do you walk by a building where you see a government document on the front? Doesn't matter if it's a building permit, application for a liquor license, street space, they all look the same, and they all tell you basically nothing about what's happening unless you really know what you're reading. Well, we obviously wanted to make this culturally competent, and we also knew that the owners primarily don't live in these buildings. It's the tenants that are going to see this. So we wanted to obviously comply with the letter of the law and put the right code language on there, but we also wanted this to explain something to the tenant. Basically, if you read it carefully, it's not saying that this building is dangerous, it's saying this building is out of compliance with the law regarding earthquake safety. And I think that was an important message, and that also led to a lot of transparency around this issue. So I'm very pleased to see how that mechanism worked for code compliance. Here's a little more information about our financing program. You heard me mention that it's basically a tax-deferred financing option. So if you're a person that elects to get this type of financing through the city with our partners, Alliance Energy and Deutsche Bank, what you end up doing is paying it through your property taxes over about 20 years. So it's a good option. It's using PACE financing, property assessed clean energy financing. So it's a way that also if you're doing a seismic retrofit, you could put solar panels, you could do clean energy improvements, and it's a way to actually bring that side of sustainability into your building while retrofitting. The reason why we combine those is we made the argument to the Board of Supervisors that retrofitting a building is a true act of sustainability. I don't think I probably have to convince anybody in this room of that, but by retrofitting this building, you're extending the lifespan of those materials, not to mention hopefully keeping it there after a disaster and not needing new resources to build a replacement structure. The private school mandatory evaluation program. Many of you in the room helped us out through that working group process. Lasted about 2 years, looking at the discrepancies that we had on how we treat our public schools and our private schools in the state of California and specifically in the city of San Francisco. If you look back on the 30-year earthquake safety implementation plan, originally this said retrofit of all the city's private schools. But I think that's when you have the lens of the transparent public working groups that actually drive policy. And what we did is when we were going through that, we realized that, hey, private schools come in all shapes and sizes, all different types of construction, and these schools themselves are all different types of organizations. Some have the ability to pay tremendous amounts right away. Some have to wait a long time to raise capital funds to be able to make these improvements. So that's why the policy choice became very clear after a while that we wanted to go after evaluation. So that way we're giving these schools the tools they need to make informed decisions about their risk. And I think what we're starting to see already as these evaluations are starting to come in is that schools are proactively saying, yes, this is something we want to address in a 5-year period, or we want to address it this summer. And it's great because they're allowed to go work with their own school communities. The city is not driving any of the timing as far as retrofits go. It's completely voluntary if a school decides to retrofit as a result of the evaluation. But what I think we're going to see is something similar that happened with Berkeley's Softstory program when they did evaluation. Yet about 40% of those folks voluntarily retrofit afterwards. So I think we're going to see something similar happen here. The findings from that report, I think most of you are probably somewhat familiar with it, but really the key here was in this slide, is that there's that large 24% chunk that we don't really know what these buildings are. There's very little information on city data. These schools, as you know, in San Francisco have moved into different types of buildings, different types of occupancies, and converted them over the years. So tracking this stuff, the city has never been very good about keeping records on that. Again, another good reason to argue for an evaluation program. And when you combine that with that 33% number, where we know just based on the vintage and the construction type that these are going to be pretty bad buildings and probably perform poorly in an earthquake. So like I mentioned, about 1.5 years of these working groups to get this policy right. But I think that's the time it takes to do policy correctly. If you look at this last term with Mayor Lee, in 3 years, we passed 15 pieces of seismic safety legislation that have all been 11-0 votes at the Board of Supervisors. Those of you who follow San Francisco politics know 11-0 votes are a pretty rare thing in our Board of Supervisors, but I think the mission's clear. I think you're getting people putting aside politics in favor of public safety. Facade maintenance program, we introduced an ordinance a few months ago. San Francisco will be the first major West Coast city to adopt a facade maintenance program. And most cities have adopted this, say, on the East Coast because of extreme weather, because of freeze-thaw issues, and you start to see that decay much quicker in those environments. However, we have that compounded with seismic risk here in California, and so while this is kind of partly just a good building maintenance ordinance, we also know it's aimed at helping our first responders after a disaster and improving public safety. We obviously want to protect the pedestrians that are there, but then also making sure we keep those routes open. We saw this in Napa. Everyone remembers that famous image of the retrofitted brick building that actually had the facade peel off. There was a pile of bricks, and I was standing there with Mayor Lee 48 hours after the earthquake, and we were talking about how if that would happen in the middle of the day as opposed to 3 in the morning, the fatality rate would look enormously different in Napa. So I think it's important to think about these things, again, in different pieces, because this is a very particular hazard. So this ordinance would probably be something in the lines of an inspection every 10 years on buildings that are, say, 5 stories or more. That's basically the direction that this ordinance is going in. Now on to some of the stuff that we're doing on concrete. So we've been working with ATC under contract, under Project ATC 119, looking at 8 different tasks, but task 2, complete development of evaluation criteria and standards for non-ductile concrete buildings, is something that's happening right now. And Aisha, I'm not going to make you come up and give your presentation on it, but Aisha happens to be the project manager for ATC on that. You know, it's not like this is a new idea. Again, this was laid out in, actually I'll go back to that. If you see everything that ATC is doing under scope has a task number associated with it, those task numbers directly correlate back to the 30-year earthquake safety implementation plan. So again, we're not trying to do something different or create a new workflow here. We actually had the master plan to begin with, and now we're following through on it, and that's the beauty of this process. Obviously, looking at the risk of concrete buildings and the density of concrete buildings here in San Francisco is fascinating, especially when you look at compared to other cities like Los Angeles or other cities in the Bay Area or Santa Monica. You realize that it becomes a very unique risk and a very unique hazard that San Francisco faces, especially when we start to look at who are occupying these buildings. You know, and you see such a huge, wide range. You have the old non-ductile, beautiful buildings in Pacific Heights that have, you know, the fancy full-floor co-op living situations, multi-million-dollar units, but then also down here in the Tenderloin, you have some of our most vulnerable populations living in very similar buildings as far as construction type goes. So I think, just like with Softstory, just like with private schools, this is an issue that's going to require very careful deliberation, very transparent and open public policy discussions as we begin to figure out what we want to do. I'm sure it was probably discussed earlier today about the recent efforts that LA made by passing the first concrete ordinance in California of this nature, and it's really exciting. You know, the idea of having 10 years to decide what you're going to do with this building, and then another 20 or 25 to retrofit it. It's a long time, but I think also these are hugely expensive costs that we frankly do not know how to deal with yet in the policy realm. So I think it's going to be a great experiment. We've been talking to Garcetti's office very closely and coordinating with them, and hopefully we will be following suit with a similar ordinance next year. To give you an idea, there's actually 3 different tasks on the ESIP work plan that relate to concrete buildings. There's the idea of kind of coming up with the inventory in this immediate phase, and there's the idea of a mandatory evaluation followed by a mandatory retrofit. It's no accident that if you look at the years and how those timelines line up, and it lines up very closely to what LA has put and codified in their ordinance. That's not an accident, obviously. We've been talking very closely with them and also talking to folks at the state level about unifying this around a particular hazard, in this case, concrete. All of this work, we tend to do a lot of it in City Hall, but it wouldn't be right if we just did it and left it in City Hall. We got to bring it out to the community. So that was really the idea behind the epicenter. Most of you have actually taken trips down there and come down and seen Lawrence there some of the days. It's been a great place to be able to kind of have this pop-up demonstration space. On this picture, you can kind of see in the background, there's a mock house that we've built with a fake foundation that shows how a properly bolted foundation looks, how you retrofit a 4-foot cripple wall, how you properly brace a water heater. But then we also have a hydraulic actuator where I basically say this is Lauren's excuse just to build stuff and break stuff down in the South of Market. But it's actually been great because we get people walking in and you'll have everybody from the most experienced engineer to the homeowner who's never even thought about this stuff. So you think about that range of breadth there and knowledge. It's fascinating to be able to work with people on all levels in the public. We are also going to be using this space as a community hub as we launch our design competition. So many of you may not be aware of this, but we're actually launching a regional design competition with Rebuild by Design. This is going to be looking at critical infrastructure throughout the Bay Area. And for San Francisco, the particular hazard that we've chose to look at is our city's seawall. Many of you are familiar with the city's seawall. There's several seawalls in San Francisco, but the one that we're primarily concerned about is our Bayside seawall that runs approximately from Aquatic Park down to AT&T Park. It's not ready for a seismic event. It's not ready for sea level rise. We already get flooding and king tides. It's got about every major utility passing through it. It's got the Transbay too, which takes hundreds of thousands of people in and out of the city. So if you think about a true area that's a multi-hazard zone and that an earthquake would magnify, it really is that city seawall. So we've been doing a lot of modeling around that. We've done seismic modeling for years, but now starting to look at sea level rise and what is the cost of inaction when you model that. Sea level rise, as I've learned, is a very tricky thing to model because it's not a singular event. It's something that happens over time. So how you model that is very different and is nuanced in a very different way. Many of you have already signed up for our email list, but I'm going to do another plug for it. If you visit our URL here at sfgov.org/ESIP, on the left-hand side, there's a way to sign up for our email updates. We're going to start doing monthly newsletters to keep people up in the loop. But also the main reason why I want to put a plug for this in is in April, I think of this year, March or April, we haven't picked a date yet, we're going to do another earthquake retrofit fair. And this is going to be an opportunity. The way it worked last year, there was no fee to participate. Any engineer, contractor, design professional, manufacturer, insurance provider, lender that wanted to participate was able to do so free of charge, and we hope we can do that again. So the way that we're going to notify folks of being involved is through that email list. So if you're not already on our email list and it sounds like something you're interested in, please sign up for it, and then you'll receive notifications probably sometime in the new year when we start organizing that. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions that might be out there.